Welcome to episode 3 of the Life in Norway show. This is the podcast of the Life in Norway blog, where we tell the stories of what it's really like to live in Scandinavia. Is Norway really the happiest place on earth? It's questions like this that I hope to answer as I interview other expats who live and work here in Norway. So far, I've spoken to guests from France and Germany, and I'm now adding a third nationality to the mix. Here on episode 3, I'm joined by an American, Audrey Camp. Audrey is a freelance writer and an American expat living in Oslo, Norway, with her husband and daughter. She received her MFA in creative writing from Lesley University and her MA in British and American literature from the University of Oslo. In March 2017, she was elected chair of Democrats Abroad Norway, and she also teaches seminars in American literature at the University of Oslo. In the beginning, we had very similar journeys. We both moved to Norway in the spring of 2011, to Oslo, and work in one form or another as freelance writers. But that's where the similarities end. Perhaps the biggest difference is that Audrey has gone on to become a parent. A stressful situation at the best of times, but made even more challenging when everything you think you know about healthcare, support systems and such like, how these things work, is different. Yet Audrey has survived, succeeded, and thrived as a parent. Here's her story. I'd like to welcome to the latest episode of the Life in Norway show, Audrey Camp. Audrey, velkommen til podden.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, we've actually met in person, but it's been many, many years, I think, since we met back in Oslo. We moved to the city both, I think, in 2011. Is that right?
Yeah, about a month apart. I was in April and you were in May.
Fantastic. So we've actually had a similar timetable to our experience here in Norway. We've probably shared a lot of those realizations and adaptations to Norwegian lifestyle around the same time.
Definitely.
But one thing I certainly haven't had any experience of is raising a child, and that's something that you've done here in Norway. So first off, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
And this is actually a topic where I lack information on the Life in Norway website, never having had a child in England or here in Norway. I'm not so up to speed with how things work here. Obviously, children have a very special place in Norwegian society. The education system is very different. The childcare system is very different. This is the topic of today's show, but first of all, let's get to know you a bit better. So what brought you to Norway in the first place?
Yes, so I'm originally from California, and my husband is as well. We grew up about a mile apart, so we're those weirdos who don't have any familial connection to Norway and just came because there was a job offer here, and we thought, why not try something new? And we arrived in Norway and pretty immediately felt like we found our people. And we dove into it thinking we'd live here maybe 2 or 3 years. And along the way realized it was a wonderful place not only to live, but to start a family. And that's something that I think maybe your listeners would also resonate with, that Norway is fairly consistently ranked as one of the top, if not the top places to raise a child, have a baby, that sort of thing. So that was definitely on our radar. We had already been married 10 years, and we were thinking about it, and it just made sense to do it here, and I'm so glad we did. So I'm a freelance writer and can sort of work anywhere in the world, and my husband is in tech, so he's got a great job with a company that was a Norwegian company but has since been acquired by a tech giant from the United States. So we get to be able to go home to California at least once a year, I think, and that's pretty convenient. And so we've since bought an apartment in Oslo, and we've had our little girl. She was born 2.5 years ago, and now she's in the Barnehage system. So I'm definitely up to speed on what it's like to be a mom in Norway.
Fantastic. Let's talk about the child to begin with, if that's okay. As a 2.5-year-old who is growing up here in Norway, is Norwegian her first language?
I would say that she has 1.5 first languages, which is like this really interesting thing since my husband and I are not bilingual. I speak more Norwegian than he does, but since we both are American, we don't speak Norwegian in the home, so we don't have that added incentive or backup in order to learn the language. So our Norwegian is still coming along, but she entered Barnehage, which is the kindergarten system here, at the age of 15 months. And so she almost simultaneously started speaking both English and Norwegian, and is fluent in both. And she's a very communicative, talkative little thing. So when she's home with us, her language is English, and that's almost all we hear. At Barnehage, it's Norwegian, and that's all that they hear. But occasionally there are little Norwenglish things that happen. So, for example, the word ikke has entered the English vocabulary. So she'll have sentences where she'll say, Mama, these are ikke pants. Like, they're not pants. Okay. And you just move past it. So the language thing has been really, really fun.
This is something I find so interesting. I mean, I am not a linguist. I really struggle learning foreign languages. Right now, I'm attempting to learn Norwegian and Spanish at the same time.
Oh, wow.
And I have all kinds of trouble. It's as if maybe it's because I'm an adult into my 30s that I have this English bucket in my head, and then I have this foreign bucket in my head. And in the foreign bucket, Norwegian and Spanish, they mix up together. It doesn't seem to happen with children. Why is that?
I was reading an article that was talking about how if a child is learning a different language before the age of 2, that it actually changes the way that their brain is wired a little bit. Like, the actual grooves in the brain as it's formed are different when you learn a foreign language when you're younger. And I think it's just because you have this natural understanding that there's more than one word for each thing or each feeling or each person even in your life. And so because it's normalized from that early age, of course, I can't speak to the biology of it exactly, but this was a really compelling argument for why kids should be at least exposed to a second language when they're younger. And the international community in Oslo is growing and growing and growing. So I know most of my friends have bilingual children, and it's fascinating to see the way that they do switch back and forth between the two languages very easily from an early age.
You are now teaching at the University of Oslo, I read.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. When we moved here, my husband's job was what brought us, and so I was writing as a freelancer as my income at that time when we moved. But I also entered a master's program that was a remote program in the United States. So I flew back and forth to Cambridge, Massachusetts to finish my degree. And once I finished that, I continued to do my freelancing work, but I had heard about a master's program in literature at the university here in Oslo. And the University of Oslo is a really great school. I entered the program, and because I am a resident here in Norway, I was able to have this excellent education, 2-year master's program for free, essentially. There's a very small, nominal semester fee that you pay, and that covers some basic expenses, but I mean, absolutely no loans that are required, that sort of thing. And so I was able to enter the master's program in American and British literature. And I started that in 2014. And then when my daughter was born in 2015, it allowed me to take some of the mama permission, or the mama leave, the parental leave that I'm allowed by the government here. It's a little different than if I had had a full-time job. If I was working as an employee of a company and had been full-time for a year prior to my daughter's birth, then I would have been able to take paid leave for, I think, up to a year. But because I was a full-time student, I didn't have that same access. What I did have was complete flexibility with the school to leave for a semester or a year, and to come back to my studies without any hitch. And they were unbelievably flexible with me when I arrived and told them that I was having a child. And I think that was the first hint that I got, just on a personal, anecdotal level, that the experience of being pregnant in Norway was very different from being pregnant in the United States as a student and or as an employee.
Sure. I anticipate a lot of Norwegian Americans and Americans in general to be listening to this episode. So that may come, what you've just said, may come as a surprise, given that, as I understand it, in America has some of the least amount of parental leave anywhere in the world. Whereas Norway has, if it's not the most, it's right up there in the top 2 or 3 countries. Can you Can you explain a little bit about the differences there between the process of having time off once you've given birth?
Sure. Yeah, because this was, again, one of the reasons that we decided to stick around Norway. Not only do we love it here and we fit in with the culture pretty well, we've got a great network of friends and associates and just people we like to be with here.
Sure.
It's a great network. But the fact when we were deciding to start a family, if we had gone back to California And I guess there I should just say, as an American, I don't get to speak for America because there's no federalized system, so I'll have to speak to it as a Californian. But you can assume that it's probably fairly similar in other places, if not worse, because California is a fairly liberal state. But as a Californian, what I would have been entitled to as a, for example, full-time employee in the state, it would have been 6 weeks of leave that would have been considered disability pay. So it would have been less than my salary. It would have been only for 6 weeks, and it would have been off of my employer's books. They wouldn't have to pay that at all. But if I decided to go back to work, I would have rights, which is important. And that's something that's only been around, I think, for the last 15, 20 years, that women who choose to have children and then come back to work, you have the right to have your job back. They have to hold your job for you, but only for that time. So it can be extended, and I can't speak to too many particulars beyond that in California. But what I can say is that here in Norway, your rights are much broader. And for example, for me as a student, I had up to a year to decide how I wanted to come back and complete my program and how I would step back into it and that sort of thing. And there was absolutely no pressure on making that decision in the early stages. I didn't have to declare any intent or that sort of thing. I just had to tell them I'm going to be on leave. And my understanding here is that with most of my friends who have had children here, when they approach their employers and say, I'm having a baby and I'll be, at home from this time to this time, the employer just smiles and says, that's great, enjoy. I'm sure that there is probably the kind of pressure that you would assume in high-powered jobs and that sort of thing probably is similar between the two countries, but really the culture here is such that it's supportive of both men and women who have children and need to stay home. My husband also had parental leave that was triggered because I was a full-time student, and he ended up being able to be home with my daughter for 5 months. And I think he did part-time, so he was 3 days a week with my daughter at home. And that was the most incredible part of the whole thing, that he was able to be there and form this beautiful attachment with her from a younger age and really get to understand her needs and become a really competent parent. I mean, he had to deal with everything that I did and be home, the whole time. And that also is a cultural difference, I think, between the States and Norway.
Would you say that of all the differences between the USA and Norway, that this area of parental leave and the approach to the state supporting new parents is perhaps the biggest difference?
Yes, I think that's a big one. Of course, the money part is a huge thing, but also just like the social stigma that surrounds people who are trying to start families, as though it's something that, well, you can do that, but it's going to slow you down, is sort of the mentality in the U.S. And here it's more like, well, of course you're going to do that. So, do it at your leisure, sort of, and figure out when it works for you. And plenty of parents here, make that plan and wait to start their families until they're a little bit older. I mean, that probably doesn't change. Oslo is still a world capital. There are still people who work very hard here. But there's definitely more of an assumption that if you're going to start a family, it's going to be a straightforward journey for you. You don't have to worry about your job. And my husband, working in tech, it's a male-dominated profession. It's an office full of men. And they all, when we arrived here 6.5 years ago, his department was all men in their late 20s to mid 30s, and none of them had children. And just within the last 3 years, almost all of them have had at least one child. And so that means that rolling Papa Permission for their department. And since they've been acquired by an American company, there was definitely head scratching at the executive level at the top, because they're like, where are all of our programmers going? And Norway would say, well, they're home with their children. And it was very much this adjustment that had to take place, I think. But no, we let our guys go home and be real parents to their kids, in the early stages of their life. So I'd say that's probably one of the biggest. The other big thing is cultural differences, for example, surrounding breastfeeding in public. In Norway, it's extremely normal, and breastfeeding is very encouraged. And so people feel very free here to just sit down in public and do that. And in the US, people still cover up or go into a room or, hide behind something in order to feed their children. And I'm so grateful that I was here in Norway for that, because as a mother, that's one of those things that you don't realize until the biology kicks in. But feeding your kid is so natural, and you have to do it when the child is hungry, especially when they're very little. And if you're running around trying to find, things to drape over yourself, it's very inconvenient and a little bit silly. And so when I went back to the States, when my daughter was about 7 months old, I was out at a public mall and I was breastfeeding her. And I definitely got, looks from people who were a little uncomfortable by my presence. And I thought, wow, this really is a different place to be. And it was negative in that sense. And it was too bad because I'd kind of hoped that maybe people had been dramatizing that or something. But
sure.
But here in Norway, it's so encouraged, and people don't sexualize the experience. And I think that's one of the main differences. They just say it's motherhood, it's part of raising a healthy child, we want it to happen, so we're not going to stigmatize it.
That's really interesting. And I'll pick up on something you said there. I think, and I agree with you, that we notice the differences between Norway and our home country, not so much when we're in Norway, but when we go back to our home country. That's when the differences really leap out at you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So answer me this. As the editor of Life in Norway, I receive emails every day full of questions about people wanting to move to Norway and their rights and work permits and immigration, citizenship and so on. So what rights does your child have, having been born in Norway, but having two American parents? I assume neither of you have become Norwegian citizens, so you're American citizens, but the child's born in Norway. Is the child a Norwegian citizen? She
is not. And this was I don't know that we would have pursued that anyway, but it was a surprise to me as an American. I don't know what it's like for you coming from the UK, but for me, there is, I don't want to say ignorant, maybe naive assumption as an American that most of our basic rights legally as Americans would pertain to other countries too. And one of those in the US, which is so famous, is the idea that if you're born there, you become a citizen. And it turns out that that's actually quite rare, that not very many countries have that right extended to anyone born on their soil. So in Norway, that's not something that extends to people who are just born here. So my daughter, because she has two American parents, has been registered with the United States government. She's an American citizen. And we had to go through all of that paperwork and visit the embassy and get her passport. One interesting thing about it was when it came time to name her, we had chosen a name a middle name for her that is a protected surname in Norway. And this is a little obscure, but it's kind of funny.
Sure.
We'd selected her first name and then we'd selected her middle name, and we were naming her middle name Muir after one of our favorite characters from American history and a great famous naturalist and father of Yosemite, essentially, National Park, John Muir. And so we were naming her with this name, and we went to the Norwegian government to submit our paperwork, and they said, sorry, the name Muir in Norway is a protected surname because only a certain number of people in Norway have this name and have had it for a certain number of years. So it was rejected. And in order to get that surname or that middle name for her, we would have had to petition every person with the surname Muir who lives in Norway currently and had them sign off on it. And we didn't want to send 200 letters requesting that. So we let that go and decided that she would not have a middle name in Norway. And then we went to submit our paperwork for the United States. They said, oh, her name can be anything you want it to be. So we wrote it in. So on her U.S. passport, she does have the middle name Muir. And in Norway, she does not.
That is super interesting. They say you learn something new every day, and I have certainly learned something new today. That is amazing. Audrey, we're going to take a short break, but when we come back, I want to talk about what it's like to actually be a parent in Oslo specifically. This episode of the Life in Norway show is proudly sponsored by the Moon Norway Guidebook. Whether you're hoping to see the famed Northern Lights, explore Norway's fjords, or visit its beautiful and historical cities, Moon Norway has activities for every traveller. With itineraries like the Best of Norway by Rail and Norway for Families, expertly crafted maps, gorgeous photos, and trustworthy advice from yours truly, Moon Norway provides the tools for planning your perfect trip. Get your copy now from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or your local bookstore. And now, back to the show. Okay, we're back with Audrey Camp for the second half of this interview for the Life in Norway show. Audrey, raising a child in a foreign country, I don't know where to begin, but let's begin with the actual pregnancy. How was that? Obviously, you have no experience of being pregnant in the USA, but I assume you have friends, family, and so on that you could swap stories with. So, what was it like
Yeah.
actually being pregnant here in Norway?
Well, at the risk of being hated and having things thrown at me by some of your mom listeners, my pregnancy was by itself already an easy thing. It was a lovely experience, and I
Right.
enjoyed the pregnancy. So, sort of taking that in mind, that it was a very normal pregnancy, and there were no outliers or things that to be afraid of, or that sort of thing, because stuff does pop up, and then I don't know if I would have felt as comfortable. But with my very straightforward pregnancy, uh, the whole system here was incredibly supportive and very different from the way it's laid out in the U.S. In the U.S., and this is my understanding again based on the stories of friends, but also things that I've read. Because at the time I'm one of those people who has to like research everything. So when I got pregnant, I was reading very much about both systems. So in the U.S., there are a certain number, for example, of doctor's appointments that you attend when you're pregnant,
Right.
and when you take your pregnancy test and stuff. It's very common to go in to the doctor and verify the pregnancy, and start doing whatever tests and that sort of thing from the very beginning. You're in touch with your doctor, your gynecologist, your OBGYN. But in Norway, it's quite different. And I learned that the day I got pregnant, at the risk of TMI here, I realized I was pregnant because I took the tests, and I didn't believe it right away. So I had taken more than one. And so I decided, well, as an American, I just thought this. I called my doctor and said, can you squeeze me in for an appointment? I just want to make sure I'm pregnant. And I showed up at his office, and he looked at me and he said, well, what makes you think you're pregnant? And I said, well, these tests. And I'm holding them in my hand because it was like a sitcom moment. And I said, these. And he said, then you are. And he wasn't going to run a blood test, and he wasn't going to, what he wasn't going to do was sort of, meet me at the level I was playing. He was like, no, you are. So now you can go home and relax. And the way that it works here in Norway is that in a standard pregnancy, you only get one ultrasound. It's done at like 20 weeks. So like halfway through, it's a 40-week long process of being pregnant. So about week 20, 19 or 20, you go in and have one ultrasound. You also meet with a midwife at the helsestasjon, the health station that's near you, and this person is a jordmor or midwife, and you meet with her. Again, it's like once in the first trimester, once in the second trimester, and then monthly in the third trimester. So it's much more relaxed than it would be in the U.S., where they're sort of like, yes, come in for all these regular appointments and have multiple ultrasounds. And I, being a nervous, excited American mom, wanted more ultrasounds than that. So I ended up going to a private clinic to get them done because I wanted to see the baby. And here in Norway, they're much more relaxed. Like, oh, you'll see at week 20, and then, you'll see when the baby's born. And I wanted to see more than that. So I ended up going and paying for it. And that's, again, totally normal, and you can go do it. There are lots of places, but there's only one that's included sort of in the free package of being pregnant in Norway. And that's the beautiful part of their system, that having a baby in Norway as a resident costs nothing. So from word one, when I said, here's what's happening, all of my appointments surrounding the pregnancy were free of charge. And when I went to see my jordmor, my midwife at the health station, she did all of her measurements and talked to me through things and did blood tests and that sort of thing along the way. And I never saw a bill for any of that stuff either. It's a free system. And yeah, so the pregnancy itself was sort of a breeze, and it was really beautiful to have a midwife in that process. And people at home in California were very skeptical about that, because the idea of midwifing kind of has some antebellum or old world connotations in the U.S. And I think that's probably starting to change a little bit. The healthcare system is, of course, in turmoil around in the U.S. right now, but there's a sense of the midwives having less stigma, I think, in some parts of the country. But where I'm from, it was definitely, what are you talking about? Isn't there going to be a doctor in the room with you when you give birth, and that sort of thing? So a very different approach to the whole process.
Gotcha. Okay, so now you and your husband have brought a new life into the world. You live in an area of Oslo which is quite trendy. It's known for its bars, restaurants, and I would say, a relatively lively nightlife.
Oh, definitely.
What is it like raising a baby in an environment like that? I think most people anywhere in the world, if you were to say, "Oh, I'm raising my baby in a city of the country's capital," they would probably raise an eyebrow. How was it for you in Oslo?
Oslo, in the first place, Oslo is not quite like all other cities in that to me, it still has a very a small town feel in a lot of ways, and the neighborhoods are quite intimate. So once you really once you really know your neighborhood, it does feel like that no matter where you are in the city. We did live on the west side for a while, but now we're on the east side, and our whole experience over here has been so phenomenal. And partly because there's nothing more convenient than having a small child in a place where you can get to your grocery store and your hardware store and all of these different shops, et cetera, within a block or two of where you live.
Right.
And the best part about having a kid in the city is that the number of playgrounds that are available to us. I mean, this is just phenomenal to me. The way that the system works here, not only are there a lot of public parks with beautiful little playgrounds, but all of the barnehager, all of the different kindergartens, the public ones, their playgrounds are accessible to the public after school hours and on weekends. So everywhere in the city, and I think I've got 10, in a 3-block radius of me or something, are all of these distinctive little playgrounds that are fenced in and safe. And so if we go to them, after school's out or on the weekends, we just have our pick. So my daughter definitely has her preferences. Will say, I want to go to the park with that slide or that sort of thing. So really great. And we're also very close to Mathallen, which is the big kind of gourmet food hall in that area over by Vulcan in Oslo. And so that's been extremely convenient for a lot of reasons. There's a wonderful bakery over there, and there's a beautiful patisserie, and just like all of these fun little foodie places to go within an easy walk. And Oslo has renovated and brought up to date the river walk, because the Akerselva River runs straight through the town. And so now there's a glorious walking trail that's well lit and clean, and you can just walk the river. So it's a great place to raise a kid. Definitely noisy, definitely can't just let the kids run out the front door and play by themselves. And so those are drawbacks that we'll probably feel more keenly when she's a bit more mobile on her own. But as of right now with a toddler, it's pretty great. And I love the public parks. That's my favorite part, I think, about being a city mom.
So let's talk a bit more about the kindergartens, the barnehage as they're called here in Norway. Sure. Am I right in thinking, again, showing my naivety here as not being a parent, am I right in thinking children start the barnehage at a younger age here?
Oh, far younger. And in fact, I don't even really equate the Norwegian understanding of kindergarten, or the way that they use the word kindergarten, with the American word kindergarten. Kindergarten in the United States is the first year of their public school system. So in that sense, it's the same because it's subsidized by the government. But it doesn't start until you're 5 years old in the United States. And so you start at kindergarten at 5 and then move into first grade at 6, et cetera, moving up. And here, the barnehage system starts after the child is 1 year old, roughly. And everyone is guaranteed a place, but they only have 2 intakes every year. And in order to get your intake, your child has to be born before a certain month in the year. So it's definitely, because Oslo is so, the population is growing, it's so impacted, they still find a way to get everybody in, but you have to follow this calendar of dates for intakes, et cetera. So my daughter started when she was 15 months, and that's pretty average. And it means that she can have access to a public kindergarten. And she got selected for, you choose from, you put a list of 5, you can research them if you want, but you're only guaranteed a spot somewhere. But you can put a list of preferences, and they try to get you into one of those on that list. So we picked 5. She was got into the 4th on our list. And it's about again, like 3 or 4 block walk from our house, so 10 minutes. And it's a wonderful kindergarten. We adore her teachers, and it's split the way that the barnehage work. It's split into one's for a small barn or small children, and one for the larger children. And so from the ages of 1 to 3, she'll be in the smaller kids section, which means that there are fewer children and more adults in those classrooms, and they do different things, kind of stay closer to home.
Sure.
And then when she's a little older, she'll move up to a larger classroom where there are more kids per adult who's watching them. But I mean, it's an incredible experience to have this subsidized by the government, heavily subsidized, and accessible to us if we wanted to have her there from 7:30 in the morning to 4:30 in the evening, 5 days a week. That's our window. And in the U.S., there's really not the concept of paid public childcare like the nothing equivalent for children. You have to do private childcare, or if you're very, very fortunate, an employer might have better benefits. I was mentioning when I was talking about like pregnancy and maternity leave earlier in California, there are lots of companies that might also give you better maternity leave than you would get from the government. But again, those are used as benefits and perks. And so you have to be in certain lines of work in order to have access to those. And so here it's across the board, no matter who you are, if you're a resident here in the city, then you have access to this for your childcare. And it's a remarkable thing. And we don't use it full time like that because we think, she's too little, or I'm pretty flexible with my working hours, so I can be around her a little bit more, and that's my preference. But she's there quite a bit of the time, and she loves it. And it's been phenomenal for us, especially in terms of socialization and the Norwegian language, which we want her to be fluent in.
Of course. Putting myself in my listeners' shoes for a moment, I still have the number 15 months rattling around my head. It seems such a young age. I mean, on the one hand, I imagine it's terrific to get some time back after 15 months with a child. But on the other hand, is there not a certain nervousness at letting your child be taken care of by someone else at such a young age?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think that could be cultural. It could also just be a mom thing. I think that I don't know if I can say that Norwegian moms are less nervous than international moms here with the system. Many of them obviously they grew up in Barnehage, so they understand that system in a way that even their parents did not, because public Barnehage has not always been a thing here, at least at this level. But I do think that, I'll just speak for myself and say that I'm involved in a very large network of international moms here in Norway, which is fantastic. And I've seen a lot of nervousness among people there. And we still go through with it for the most part, because it's this incredible, I want to say benefit, but it's not something that's being offered as a perk. It's something that we're all entitled to. It's a right. But it's this incredible service to us from the government here to be able to have this childcare. And it's there specifically to allow moms and dads to some extent to go back to work. I mean, the society wants people to be working and to be making money and to be doing this for their families and for the country. And it works like that. When I was taking my daughter at 15 months to go drop her off there, yes, I was extremely freaked out by the fact that she was so tiny. And she was a, very bright, able little kid. And so again, I had it easy in the sense that she sort of made that transition quickly and was bright and curious and wanted to have friends and wanted to meet people. And so I was able to get through that transition with, minimal scarring for me. But there was definitely trepidation on my part when I was taking this little tiny, human to this place. And the thing that did it for me, that really made it feel okay, was the fact that the Barnehage workers, who I consider teachers, but they sort of refer to themselves a little differently. But the Barnehage workers have been so loving and so quick to really care about my daughter specifically and her needs. And they pay very close attention to her, and I get reports. And one of the best things is that my Barnehage, at least, has an Instagram that's private, and each class has its own little Instagram feed that's private and only the parents have access to, and they can allow us to see exactly what our kids are doing during the day. And so I get to see her with her face painted, or I get to see her feeding the ducks, or I get to see her doing these things. And one of the most beautiful parts of the Barnehage system here is that they have an emphasis on having the kids play outside as much as possible. So the kids are constantly out, any weather, I think down to -10 C. They're outside and enjoying the world. And they also go på tur at least once a week as a class. And so they put on their little shiny vests and they get into their wagons and they're taken as a group down to another public park, or they go visit another Barnehage, or they do something where they're actually leaving the school. And that's a great deal of effort, really, to corral 6 to 9 little toddlers and take them someplace. And they do it every week. And so my daughter's been out grilling hot dogs in the woods with her little class, or she's gone out to like Hovdøya, one of the islands in the fjord. And so she's having these adventures at this very young age. And it's a beautiful thing because it also lets me see how independent she can be. And so there were certainly growing pains in that transition, but oh, I love it. I would not trade it for anything. It's the reason that I will certainly be here for the next 4 years while she finishes out the Barnehage run for sure.
Sure. I mean, I often talk about how children have this very special place in the Norwegian society, but finally I have an example now that I can point people towards. And just so everyone's clear, this isn't specific to your Barnehage. This is quite general. I mean, here in Trondheim, at the other side of my housing estate, there are 2 barnehages, and I frequently see the barnetog, the child's train, as it's called, waddling along through the estate to the playgrounds. And
there's nothing cuter than that.
Especially in the winter when they've all got their neon green, red, yellow, pink clothes on, and they're playing just as if it's the height of summer. It's really quite surprising. I remember not enjoying playing in the snow as a child.
Yeah. I mean, there definitely is a pressure on the kids here to like it outside, but I really, for the most part, think they're batting 1,000 on that. I think that you'll have the rare kid who really doesn't want to, but for the most part, they just love it. And I think it's because it's normal for them from such a young age and made very easy. I mean, imagine my sweet daughter, she has 2 California parents. We barely understand how to exist in the snow. So if we were trying to do this without the help of the Barnehage, I think her experience with snow would be very different from a young age. And so, I'm just so grateful to this system for exactly that.
Well, Norwegian children are born with skis on their feet, so I imagine that applies to your daughter equally as much, even if she's not a Norwegian citizen.
And let me jump in there because you didn't actually ask me about the way that childbirth works here, and I won't take you into the delivery room, but I will say that while the pregnancy was, it was, again, very straightforward and everything is free and that sort of thing, that also applies to giving birth in Norway, that you have access to the public hospitals. And when you go into labor, you're put into the system in the hospital. And again, I gave birth at Ullevål Hospital in Oslo, and they were phenomenal. And one of the beautiful things about Ullevål is that they have a family hotel that's attached to the hospital. So after you give birth, if everything goes normally, you and your husband and your child are moved into this hotel for, I think, 5 or 6 nights. And so for the first week that you are a parent and you have this little tiny being who suddenly you are in 100% responsible for keeping alive and fed and happy, or at least alive and fed in those early days, you are within a buttons press of assistance from midwives or from health sisters and nurses. And you have your own little private room and you have access to food on the premises, and you don't have to think about anything else except adjusting to the very basic and sort of traumatizingly different life that you're going to have once you're parents. And that's, again, something when we walked out of the hotel and on that 6th day and our only bill was for my husband's food and everything else was covered. It was like, it was like being given just this giant gift. And of course we knew it was coming, but it's, again, when you're coming from another culture where that's not the same, or another kind of society where that's not the same, it's such a relief that you don't have to worry about those things, and that you've been supported from day one to the last day. And now you're out in the world and the system is set up for you as parents. So I did want to make sure I threw that story in there so people understood it goes all the way through the birth process.
Sure thing. Fantastic stuff. I'm really getting an insight here, and I'm sure my listeners are too, especially those who maybe are in the USA or otherwise outside of Norway. Things work so differently here, and one of the most common questions I get asked is, how do you cope with the high taxes? And the answers I give, first of all, the taxes aren't actually as high as most people think. Secondly, they get used for things like this, which you can't argue with, that it's a benefit to society as a whole.
Mm-hmm. It makes my husband and I sort of proud that we lived here for 4 years before we had our daughter, because that meant that we were actually in the society. We were working hard. We were creating. We were getting income. We were paying back into the system. And we'd been doing that for 4 years. And so it almost felt like this was something we were getting back directly. And, and that's not true for everyone. I think that some people kind of debate, people who are not big fans of the idea of taxes sort of in general will say, well, I don't want my taxes to pay for somebody else's ... And the thing about that is that you're, as an individual, not everything is going to happen to you. So like men aren't going to go through childbirth, for example, or, a healthy young person isn't going to be dealing with the late onset Alzheimer's at that time. But you go through in a system and you're paying into something that says, whatever my need will be, there's going to be something given back to me at that time in my life. You're paying into the collective. And if you're fortunate enough to go through your whole life and pay into this system kind of as an insurance policy, and it never needs to pay out for you, then that's fantastic. And you lived a beautiful life and you'd never had to worry. And I think people underestimate the value of not having to worry about that big, bad moment. And as Americans who live here, and we grew up in a system where you had to worry. And so now being here this long, it's a little bit addictive. And I think that, some people worry that we're far too, so we say socialized in our politics at this point. But, the way I see it, just the fact of being pregnant and then going through the birth experience and then going through having a young child here and the support system there, incredible. They really stay on top of you and help you know when to go to all of your doctor's appointments. They check up with you and your child. Every medical need for your child is free. Dental stuff kicks in for your kid, I think, at the age of 3 and is free until they're 18 or something. I mean, these kinds of benefits that come down the pipe so that it makes parenthood so easy. That's a major benefit to living here. And it's one of the reasons why, again, Norway continues to rank as one of the best places in the world to have a family.
Sure. Well, I think it's clear to me and to everybody listening just how much you like it here. You like living in Norway. And
yeah, I'm feeling a little weirdly, I feel like I'm sucking up or something. I'm really not. I was trying to think of, what's a downside. And I would say that the only thing that was hard was the fact that I had not mastered the language to the point where I could feel comfortable talking about things in medical terms during the pregnancy or the childbirth. And so when I was in labor, for example, I asked that all transactions in the labor and delivery room be done in English. And that's a really high order for medical professionals to have to swing over and deal in English just for my benefit. And it certainly did not work the whole time. They needed to be able to communicate their own stuff. But so things like that made it slightly outside of my comfort zone. But because, again, I had a very straightforward experience, it wasn't a problem. If you talk to someone who had something else, some hiccup come up in the pregnancy or in the birth, then I'm guessing that would heighten a bit, not having that comfort zone of your own native language being spoken around you by the doctors. So that kind of thing is there. But really, overall, it's just so positive. It's hard to find something negative to say, at least at this point. And I did mention to you, I don't have an understanding of or experience with the school system, for example. And not everything I have heard about that from the age of 6 onward is positive. So I'd like to figure it out for myself, and I don't want to pass along bad information, which is why I'm not talking about it. But it is definitely different. I think that the needs of the child, the needs of the parent change when the kid becomes that age. And so for right now, everything is looking rosy for us as parents of one small toddler in the inner city of Oslo.
Fantastic
it's all
stuff.
Very
so
good.
Speaking of the inner city of Oslo, now that your child is in the Barnehage system, you have some free time, especially as you are a freelance writer and have some time during the day, maybe to yourself. Where are your favourite hangouts in Oslo, whether it's for a quick coffee or to meet with a parents group or...
Oh, yeah. I mean, I love this city. There are so many great places to go. Right now, I spend a lot of time on campus. I was mentioning earlier that now I work as a seminar instructor for the Introduction to American Literature course at the university. And so I'm on campus quite a lot. And I really do love the University of Oslo campus. It's fun, but it's out at Blindern, so it's not like it's right in town. And so if I'm in town and I'm looking for some place to be, I love the Mathallen, as I mentioned earlier. There's a great little coffee place called Hendrix Ibsen, which has incredible mochas. And they have also, which has been great for me as a freelance writer, kind of an annex that's in a nearby building that's a free co-working space. So I go there quite frequently, and it's right at street level. and has a beautiful view of the river, and it's free, and anyone can go in there, and there's free Wi-Fi, there's lots of seating, and it's light and colorful and pretty. And so I'm there quite often to do work when I don't want to be working from home on my writing projects. And beyond that, when I'm trying to run around and meet people, I'm trying to think. I love taking my daughter to the library. The Dijkmans Bibliotheek is a really great library. It's in a beautiful old building. They're actually going to move into a brand new facility sometime in the next 3 years. But this old building is lovely, and they've redone the children's section, so it's completely renovated and new. And my daughter just loves to run around in there. And we go to story times and that sort of thing. And beyond that, there's Litteraturhuset, which is the House of Literature in Oslo. And they have a fantastic program of visiting lecturers and authors. I just heard Cameron Whitehead talk. He's the author of The Underground Railroad, which won, I want to say, the Pulitzer Prize for Literature within the last year. And so this kind of caliber of author comes in and visits Oslo and has, conversations on stage at this place. And it's cheap, if not free, to get in for most of it. So that's a really great place to visit and get a taste of culture. But a lot of my my things are sort of tainted with this literary life that I like to pretend I lead. So it all has roughly the same flavor. It's all about writing and coffee and that sort of thing.
Sure. Audrey, I have learned so much today, and I'm sure everyone else has. Thank you so much for joining us. But before I let you go, I have 3 quickfire questions.
Sure.
That I ask everyone, and I'm really intrigued as to what your answers are going to be given what we've discussed so far. So quick answers, please. What's the best thing about living in Norway?
Oh, it has to be the way that the society supports having a small family, for sure.
What do you find most challenging about living in Norway?
I'll say that the most challenging thing about living in Oslo is the difficulty in learning Norwegian. It's such a cop-out, but it's true, because everyone here speaks English and they switch just to make it easier on me.
Sure, fair enough. Final question. Where is your favourite place to be in Norway, whether it's for a week-long visit or just for that one moment? Lofoten, which it's an archipelago of islands above the Arctic Circle. My husband and I have been there twice, once for a backpacking trip, and I would go back again in a heartbeat, because there is nothing more dramatically beautiful than that spot. And for me, just incredibly inspiring to be in that much stark, vast nature. And it's like nowhere else I've ever seen on Earth. And that's such a special feeling. And in Norway, at least, it's easy to be sort of isolated and on your own. You can be as remote as you want. And that's very attractive for me and my husband. It's not for everybody, but we really love that. And so I would say that that's probably my favorite spot in Norway. Yeah, I think that is an answer I'm getting from a lot of people, and understandably so. Thank you very much, Audrey. Show notes for this episode, including links to several things we've talked about, can be found at lifeinnorway.net. But Audrey, where can people find out more about you and some of your projects?
Oh, I'd love people to look me up. You can follow me on Twitter at Audrey Camp. You can also find me on Instagram, which I think is at Audrey&nbsp. And I do have a blog, and it's a little bit quiet because I've done the mother thing now, and it definitely sucks up my time. And I also have taken up this new job, and so that is where most of my writing goes. However, I have had a couple of fun writing projects, and one of them might be very interesting to your listeners, and that was that I co-authored a startup guide for Oslo. And so anyone who's interested in entrepreneurship in the capital of Norway, what kind of funding options are available, programs, accelerators, co-working spaces. I profiled 10 different co-working spaces just in Oslo. All of that is in the guide, and you can find that at startupeverywhere.com. And the guide is for sale, I think, for €20. It's a beautiful guide. The designers did a lovely job. And so it gives a really special niche look at the capital. So I have to promote that. And beyond that, if you visit my website, which is audreycamp.com, you can find my blog, and you can also find details about contacting me other ways. And learn a little bit more about the kinds of things I write, because my writing pops up in crazy places like fashion magazines and stuff like that. So it's a real pleasure to be on your show, David. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm so excited about this project. I hope you'll have me on another time sometime.
There are many topics I want to discuss with you, so absolutely I want you back on the show within a couple of months. And hopefully we get the chance to catch up in Oslo sometime soon. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome.